To get started glazing, you'll need a palette to put your glaze on, and our palettes are round like this. There are semi-spherical indentations in them, which are called wells, and that's where you put your glaze. There's also a center mixing area in which you can mix glazes, and then on the back side should be a number, and you'll be assigned a palette for the trimester. Other things that you might need besides the palette are a sponge, a container of water, your brushes, which are at your table, and then you might even choose to work on a banding wheel, which you can set your ceramic object on. You can see the object better this way, and you can also spin the object without actually touching the tile in case it's wet. You might want to get some paper towel also. That's usually helpful with glazing. We have about 30 or so glazes. Some of them are solid colors that you might find in the rainbow or neutral colors. Some are more textured looking, like malachite. And some of the glazes are matte or not glossy in texture, but most of them are glossy. So the glazes and the samples are in the back, so you might look at the samples first before you decide which glaze that you're going to use. The glaze in the bottle looks a little bit different from when it fires. It tends to be lighter and sort of like a chalky substance after you paint it on the object, and then it will fire a little bit different. Some colors are very different, like amber ash. It looks red, but it fires to like a sand color. Chartreuse is a yellow-green, and it kind of looks like what it fires to, but it's a little bit different. So make sure you look at the samples before you choose your colors. I also have terracotta samples. We have not used terracotta clay yet, but we will eventually use it, and the glaze looks a little bit different on those as well. Okay, so what I'm going to do is get some glazes. I have black and coral, and I'm going to get a few more glazes. Make sure you pick up the glaze bottle by the body. Don't pick it up by the cap. And if you can't get the cap open, just tap it on the table or on a counter. And sometimes glaze will dry inside the cap and make it stick. So I'm just going to fill up like maybe a little over half the amount of the well. You don't need a ton of glaze. And then I'll make sure the cap is back on. I think I'll get amber ash. If it wants to come out. It's a little bit thicker. Then ivory. If you get glaze that drips down, please make sure that you wipe the bottle before you cap it and put it back. Okay, so I've got some glazes here. There's also a clear glaze which fires clear, but when you paint it on, it kind of looks like light blue, but it will be clear, I promise. Okay, so I'm going to get started with glazing now. I'm going to show you a few different techniques, and then you'll get to practice on your own. So I'm just going to zoom in a bit here so that you can see how to do each of these glaze techniques. Okay, so the first technique I'm going to show you is called inlay. So I'm going to write this down. You can write it down too, inlay. So inlay is done on a textured area. So you should have at least one textured area on the surface. And I'm going to get a brush to use. And I'm going to use a dark color like black And I'm going to put it all over a textured area. Make sure you spread out the glaze. Don't leave it like really thick on the surface. It will take a long time to dry, and it will probably be uneven. And you can tell that when it's fired. Some areas will look thicker than other areas. Okay, so I put some black there. I'm going to rinse out my brush in the water container and make sure you squeeze your brush dry. I have to fix that one. And we just want the surface of this to dry. So within a few seconds it should start to dry up. The more coats you put on Bisqueware, which is what this is, the slower it dries. So Bisqueware absorbs water very quickly, but as you begin to layer glaze on the surface, the drying begins to slow. Okay, so this is mostly dry. Now what I'm going to do is take a wet sponge, or damp sponge really, not soaking wet, and very lightly I'm going to wipe away the glaze that's on the surface. And the glaze that's inside of the texture, as long as your texture is deep enough, the glaze will stay underneath. So very lightly, I'm just wiping away the surface glaze. And I'm going to get this area next to it because I kind of smeared the glaze around. Okay, so now I'm going to let that dry because it's a little wet from the water. The next technique, which is just your basic technique, would be brushing. We're just taking a paintbrush and we're brushing on the glaze. So I'm going to flip over my tile, and I'm going to glaze it everywhere except where the tile touches the banding wheel. So from here underneath to about here, I can glaze all of this area underneath, just not where it touches. So I'm going to take some amber ash and I'm going to spread the glaze on with a brush. I'm going to do this entire area. So if you have multiple textured areas, you can do inlay on all of them or just on one of them. And again, when you're brushing your glaze on, make sure that you spread out all the glaze so that it dries. Okay, so I'm going to leave that alone for a second. I'm going to go back to my inlay, and I could just leave the unglazed areas Bisqueware, or what I could do is glaze either clear or a lighter color over top. The glaze is a little bit transparent. It's not totally opaque, where it's like a color on top will cover up a color underneath. But this is why we're also practicing glazing. Okay, so I have some clear, and I'm just going to brush it right over top of that area. Make sure I get the whole area. Now I'm going to flip back to the back side. Every area that you glaze, with the exception of when you do inlay, you will glaze 3 coats. So the inlay, when you put it under the surface, you only have to do that once, and then you would put 3 coats of clear or another color on top. So that's my second coat on amber ash. And then I'm going to put another coat of clear because it's just about dry. You should let your layers dry up before you put another coat on, otherwise you'll just be pushing it around. Okay, so they're both wet. Now I'm going to go to the next technique. Even though I'm not quite finished with those other two, I'm going to remember that I have one more coat to do on each of those. Another technique is blending. Blending. So we're going to blend 2 colors into each other so it looks like a slow, gradual change in color, also called a gradient or gradation. So to do a gradation, what you're going to do is take one color and brush it on. And then you're going to take another color. I'm just going to get another brush out. And brush it on right next to the other color. And then what you can do is get your paintbrush wet and you can blend the colors together. You can also just blend the colors if the 2 colors are wet next to each other. But the first coat is difficult to blend wet colors because they dry so fast. So now I'm going to put another coat on. And I suppose if you put it on a bit thicker this time, that you can get them to blend. So blending is a little more difficult. It's tricky to get that gradation smooth. I'm going to go back to my clear. Oops. This is my last and third coat on that area. So I want one more coat of coral, one more coat of chartreuse. And I'm blending them together. going to add more chartreuse over here. I'm just going to bring the chartreuse down. You can mix glaze colors, although I would only mix as much as you're going to use, because if you mix glaze colors together, you cannot return the glaze to the bottle if you took too much. I might also remind you or tell you that the edges of your tile should be glazed as well. So don't forget those. So I have one more coat of amber ash on the back, on that area. So I'm going to get a little more glaze and I'm going to finish that up right now. And if you have to pick up your tile, just be careful because you have to watch for the wet areas. Okay, so this is my last and final coat. Third and final coat of that glaze. And while that's drying, I'm going to glaze this area. And I'm going to glaze it. I'm going to use ivory. So that's the matte glaze, that's not shiny. The lighter colors like ivory and clear and white can be difficult to glaze with because especially on the white clay it's hard to see where you glazed. So you kind of have to really take a look at it and see if you've gotten all the areas. And if you don't think you have, it's better to just put a little extra on and to forget about it. The amber ash kind of blended with the ivory, so we'll just see what that turns out as. It's good to experiment. Of course, I just kind of like made sure that it blended. Okay, I'm going to check on my amber. It's almost dry. Another technique that you can do is called sponging, which is exactly what it sounds like. You're taking a sponge to apply glaze. So I'm going to make sure my sponge is cleaned out. And you don't want your sponge to be real wet either when you're doing sponging because it can dilute the glaze. Can water it down and it won't be as effective. I'm going to take black, and I've got some black on my sponge and I'm just going to blot some of it off so it's not really thick on there. And then what I'm going to do is just use the sponge to make like a texture. So I'm doing black on top of amber ash. A sponge could also be used for blending. Okay. We have 2 more techniques to do. Before we do the techniques, I'm going to make sure that this ivory has enough glaze on it. There's a hair in there. If that happens, it will burn off in the kiln, so don't really worry about it. Unless it's really bothering you, then you can try to pick it off, but you might end up getting glaze everywhere. While that's drying, I'm going to go to another spot and, well, I'll just do chartreuse, I guess, over this textured area. Make sure you get the sides. I'm just going to put chartreuse on this edge. We'll see what that ends up looking like. One more coat of ivory cream. Make sure you spread it all out. Okay. All right, so the last 2, we're going to do dry brushing. So dry brushing is a way to use a glaze and a brush to get like a textured looking brush stroke. So you get just a little bit of glaze on your brush, and you might even blot some off like you did with the sponge. And then what you do, I'm just going to do it in this corner here, you just kind of make textured brush strokes. So you do another color on top of a color underneath, and then you can see like a textured look made by the brush strokes and the color underneath. So that's dry brushing. That's a little bit of a skill, so you might have to practice it a little bit. And the very last technique that we'll do is called dripping. Dripping. So what I'm going to do is take some glaze and I'm going to just drip it and let gravity kind of take the glaze, and it will make an interesting shape or line. So what I'm going to do is take a little bit of black and I'm going to put it into another well, and I'm going to add some water to it to make it a little more drippy. And then what you do is take a nice big gob of glaze, and you might put it on the edge somewhere, and then allow gravity to take it and let it drip down. And you could drip them in different directions. You could make them go sideways. So you can do all different kinds of stuff with dripping. Okay, so I'm just going to look at my tile. It looks like actually I could go a little bit further right here and a little bit further right here. So make sure all the visible areas, if you can turn it around and look at it while it's sitting down, are covered up. So I'm going to do 2 more coats and all the edges are glazed, and you have all the different techniques that we observed here on your tile. Now the extra glaze gets returned to the bottle because the glaze is very expensive and we shouldn't put it down the sink, especially if it's just not used. So what I'm going to do is put the glaze back in the bottle, and I'm going to do so by just taking a large paintbrush and kind of scooping it like a spoon and putting it back into the bottle. If your glaze mixed together, don't put it back in the bottle. If your glaze is watered down, don't put it back in the bottle. But get as much as you can. Close your glaze. So looking at my palette, the chartreuse mixed a little bit, so I don't know that I would put that back in the bottle. This coral has a little chunk in it, but the rest of it can go back in the bottle, and then the black, but not the watered down black. So once you get all your glazes back in the bottle, then what you'll need to do is wash out all your brushes until they're clean. Make sure that they're not soaking, that they don't have to be really dry like this one, but they should be not dripping with water. And that when you store your brushes, you put them so that the brush side is up, like this. Okay, so you'll clean your palette. You're going to keep it because you're going to use it throughout the trimester. Wash all your brushes. Make sure you clean up all of your mess when you're finished.